27. Acts chapter 27. So Paul is Acts is only 28 chapters, so we're getting to the very, very end of the book of Acts. I hope you've seen how sometimes the Lord leads you very directly. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes the Lord kind of allows you just to see your surroundings, see the situations that you're in, see the needs around you, and the Lord also encourages us to meet in those ways. And yet, sometimes the Lord has to push us a little bit to get us to do things. And sometimes we see a guy riding in a chariot down Lake Avenue, and we jump in the chariot with them. We start talking about Isaiah. And so the normal situation, all of us have done that. So, sometimes those situations are also what occurs. But Acts chapter 27 is mainly about Paul being shipwrecked on an island. It's pretty straightforward. He got to shipwreck. But we're going to see some really interesting things toward the end of the chapter. And we're going to show you also how beautiful Malta actually is, the island of Malta. But in verse 1, it says, "And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some of other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and remarking in a ship from Amratia," we'll go with that, "which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We put in to sea and accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. And the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra of Lycia, and there a centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board." Lots of little names that we see. As far as a map, you may find this in the back of your Bibles. It may be paired up with Paul's third missionary journey. Here is the journey by itself. And so the world is starting to open up as well. Now, remember, Paul has went as far as Macedonia, about the middle of the map, right up there where Thessalonica was. That's where, of course, the letter to the Thessalonians would eventually end up at. He goes down, and where you see the big bold words, Achaia, if you can't see it from the back, right there in that area, that's where Corinth was. All right? Up top where Thessalonica is where about Philippians, or Philemon, Philippi was, where the letter to the Philippians goes. And so we see the world's opening up, and Paul is going to go further than he has ever went before. He certainly, if he continued to be more in a free situation, not imprisoned, he probably would have kept going and went further and further away. And but we know that eventually the gospel did keep spreading, and it spread, and we're on the other side of the world as benefits of that very thing. The gospel spreads. The gospel will continue to spread. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. We will have tough times. The gospel never says that we won't have tough times, but we can see the majority of what we just read, he's only at Lycia right there, and so he's going to set sail. This time, the centurions, remember, although he is technically a prisoner, Paul has not done anything wrong situationally yet where he's actually in prison. He is just being protected by centurions. And the easiest way to be protected by centurions is if you're with the rest of the prisoners, you're kind of all going to Rome. As a Roman citizen, you had the right to appeal to Caesar. And so you would appeal to Caesar. They had to get you to Caesar in order to appeal to him. And so Paul's citizenship actually helped him survive the situation. They were going to go kill him in Jerusalem. The people were trying to find a way to sneak, ambush him, something, and so he appeals to Caesar. Festus says, hey, you should just let him go. He really hadn't done anything wrong. It's their problem. It's the Jewish problem. Don't worry about this stuff. Don't get in all of this mess. And King Agrippa said, well, I wanted to hear him out. And so Now Paul's on his way to Rome. It's a long journey. It's a long, hard journey too. But it is technically the fastest by boat, although it is quite perilous, as we're going to see. But the centurion was nice to him because he's technically he hasn't done anything wrong yet. He's going to appeal to Caesar. Now, the Caesar that he will appeal to is Nero. Nero is in charge, but Nero has not started the persecution yet. So Nero's the bad guy, but he's kind of bad necessarily yet. A light just switches on. He has convulsions. We know that from Roman documents, and we'll get into that later. But Nero is a bad guy. And it says, and we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. So what's interesting is Cnidus, if you see Lycia, you can see that Cyprus is way over here, the little island. They go here to Myra, and then they go around to Cnidus. Now, that little bit, that inch of distance, took them days to sail that way. So it's pretty difficult waters that are starting to show up. But when they're sailing, and the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete, off of Salmon, which is when he goes down to the land of Crete. So coasting along, it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest, northwest, and spend the winter there. That's interesting, okay? There's a lot actually there. I mean, you're talking about it took them days to go a couple hundred miles. We could get to anywhere on this map within a day. Do you realize the significance of that? All of us say, hey, we want to see where Paul was in Crete. We want to see the harbor. We want to see the rocks that he stepped out onto. All of us could get there within a day and a half. We have layovers. There's always layovers. But we could get there on a plane immediately. These people were going to stop on the island of Crete for all of winter because of the turbulence. But that's a part of the situation they lived in. That's a part of the thing. But something I think what's interesting is that consider the way we think through some of those events just like that. Like, hey, I appeal to go see the president. Well, you're not getting that anyway, okay? I appeal to go see the governor. We could go see the governor. You can make kind of an appeal to him. We could go see the governor. And we could, honestly, during a working week, may be able to do it in just a few hours. And they were going to take months to do this very thing. And so to consider that Paul was going all of these distances just to minister the gospel, and we could presumably call Crete right now. Think about that. We could call Crete right now today and say hello. Now, we wouldn't understand their language. They don't speak English. However, we could call them and just say, hey, what's going on? How's the weather over there? And yet he is in this tumultuous time. Remember, Paul is still thinking he's going to die. He said, hey, I'm ready to be imprisoned in Jerusalem. I'm even ready to die. And yet, now he's not even close to Jerusalem anymore, believing he may never go back. And yet, you see how sometimes we think one way, and then God has a slightly different path. But the deviation, a man's heart plans his ways. Paul's heart had been transformed by the renewing of his mind. The mission of what he knew to be true was to go preach the gospel. And so he went and preached the gospel. However, a man's heart plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. And so Paul didn't even know. Do you realize he's not even written his prison epistles yet? There's 4 of those, and they're good ones. Prison epistles are pretty good letters. But you consider, he's not even been in prison yet to write those letters. And he seemingly may not even make it because he don't even know if they're going to survive. Wouldn't that be crazy? as an apostle, you just die in a shipwreck. And you kind of expect to die as a martyr. And he doesn't know, though. But he's preaching the gospel anywhere he goes. He is preaching the gospel while he's been in prison the last 2.5 years in Jerusalem. People are still coming to his aid. The church is still growing. He's still teaching them. We don't have those letters because, well, he probably didn't have to write them. He allowed people to come in. And yet, he's like, Lord, what are you doing? I was going to go to Jerusalem and I was going to be triumphantly martyred in the same city as our Lord, possibly crucified on the same hill. That has a good story to it. We like good stories. And yet, he still, even though the prison epistles aren't written, there's other letters of Paul that still actually haven't been written. Paul goes to Rome, he gets in prison, and he actually, not many people realize this, but he actually gets out of prison for a short time. For several months, I think it's like 8 or 9 months or so, he gets out of prison and then gets put back into prison in Rome. And then that's when, at the end of that time, that's when he is actually killed. But until that time, I mean, Paul's got a lot more living to do. And, something that we can see is that when we look at our own situations and our own lives, we must refuse to get in a situation to where we think, well, we're done. It's just, that's over. We're done. It's over. I'm getting too old. I'm getting too tired. I'm getting too restless. I'm getting too frustrated. I'm getting too angry. I'm getting too weak and weary in doing good. I'm just going to let the Lord handle it from here. But here's the thing. Paul didn't think that way. Now, he was certainly surprised by a few things, but he didn't handle it that way. He said, look, everywhere I'm at, I will preach Christ and Him crucified. And that's what he does. Now, he gives his opinion on the sailing, which, I have to give it to the centurion. I wouldn't have paid attention to Paul. I would have paid attention to the boat captain that sails this exact thing several times. If you think about the boat that they're on, just to give you some perspective, the boat that they're on is an Alexandrian boat. Guess where Alexandria is? It's in Egypt, way down here. And he was sailing up, taking supplies, and then he's going on to Rome. So jumping boats. They're jumping Greyhound buses as they make their way across the ocean. But he's staying true to what God has told him to do. The fast, when he mentions the fast in there, that is actually quite a significant thing. The voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. The fast, the Day of Atonement was celebrated, and there was a fast before that happened. And when the Day of Atonement it was before winter, a certain amount of days. And at that point, some of the passes that you would go through in the Mediterranean Sea, they're just too chaotic. So it's very dangerous to sail them. And so after the fast, it's known like you don't really sail after the fast because it's just too wild. And you're getting to open sea quite a bit. And so it's a little dangerous. They don't really like to do that kind of thing. And even Paul kind of points that out. He's like, look, I don't own a boat, but I do know something. This is pretty dangerous. Centurion says, hey, the sailor, the boat guy, he said he could do it. So who cares? Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeastern, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of the small island called Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure a ship's boat after hoisting it up, and they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground at Styrus, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison some of the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Man, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the Lord, of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all, those who sail with you. So take heart, men. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Paul understood that this situation is getting a little rough. But Paul has a vision from an angel. The angel tells him, hey, this is going to happen. But guess what? You are going to be saved. It's all going to be okay. And then when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that they might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, it had lowered the ship's boat into the water under pretense of laying out anchor from the boat. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. All of a sudden, they start listening to a non-sailor. Because all that has happened so far, well, it does seem we're going to survive, but we still got to get on land. 14 days they were on this boat. I don't know about you. I grew up around the ocean. I've been on a boat a lot, but 14 days is a long time to be on a boat. Now remember, some of the boat is a slave boat. We know that that would have absolutely been a slave boat. It would have been a cargo boat as well. I tried to find a really good picture of it, but they were super cartoony, so I didn't. But they weren't super big, but they weren't super small boats either. But they were sailing in a very intense place, a hard place. And one point I wanted to point out to the next little bit was there is 276 persons in this ship. That's a lot of people to be upon this boat. 276. We have 140-something chairs set out in this sanctuary at the moment. So take that into consideration. There's a lot of people on this little boat. And people are starting to kind of believe Paul has got something extra to bring to it. But then we have in verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land. But they noticed a bay with the beach. They had shipwrecked in the previous few verses. There was a beach on which they had planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosing their ropes and tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresails to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, lest they should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Man, he's just trying to tell people about Jesus. Have you ever had those moments where you're like, Lord, I'm just trying to do what you've told me to do. My finances are going crazy. My job situation is going crazy. My situation at home is not good. And then yet, we look at Malta today. This is Malta. This is some of the rocks that you can see underneath the ground. The dark spots would be reef. And they could have come into this very place. Beautiful area. I would like to go to Malta. And yet, Paul is trying to survive Malta. Today it is a very nice and prosperous, perfect sunset view. People live on Malta. There's quite a few people that live on the island of Malta. It's not very big, but yet a sunny, great place. And Paul is barely surviving this situation. But here's also something. You see, God can see these kind of moments when we can't. God can see these nice sunset beaches, these homes that people are living in. Do you realize that when Paul kind of interacts with some of these people, some of the people come to know the Lord. Some of these people, there's churches here that you can go visit on Google Maps. You can look at the churches. The churches are there because of who? Because of Paul, the apostle, being shipwrecked on the island. Paul, the apostle, came into this by the cover of night. They woke up the next day and they said, okay, there's a beach we could go. And then they run aground. They're going to be killed because they don't want the prisoners to escape. They're jumping off. They're swimming to shore. They're under a stressful situation. And they're wondering, Paul's like, Lord, this ain't ministry. But here's the thing. This is ministry. Sometimes in your own personal evangelism, disciple making, just your own life, there's going to be situations where there's going to be storms. You cannot see the goodness at the end. Remember what we've talked about several times. We repeat this verse sometimes. That all things work together for the good of those who love Him. But what do we also say? Well, we say what the verse doesn't say. It doesn't say everything will be good. It says all things work out for the good. In the moment, it's a little hard to swallow that when you're swimming to shore, hopefully you don't get eaten by a shark. There's sharks here. You don't get eaten by a shark. You're a missionary just trying to tell people about the love of Jesus. You're trying to survive. It's hard to see the good that's going to come from it. It's hard to see far enough past our own situation sometimes to see the good. And yet, there can be good in the midst of heartache, in the midst of stress and anxiety, your bills not being paid, your housing kind of up in the air, your marriage fighting, your kids wandering away from the Lord, your grandkids wandering away, your car breaking down right after you finally get the water heater fixed, finally you get the kids feeling better again. All of those situations can be storms in our lives, and yet He works everything out for the good. And you know what? Paul never saw these homes. Ever think about that? Paul never saw this stuff. They were pretty simplistic living, being on an island. There's not just a ton of trees, but Paul never saw this stuff. He didn't see the 3 or 4 churches that are on Malta that would continue his legacy of what he was doing. He never got to see that. But that also tells me something, that in ministry, although it's nice to see, I may never see the fruits of some of the things that we're doing. You may never see some of the fruits of your labor. Sometimes we're called to plant. Sometimes we're called to water. Sometimes we're called to harvest. And yet, God is the one who does it all. And so, when we see storms in life, when we see situations, just think, well, I'm not swimming to shore for my life. Say that to yourself once or twice. I'm not swimming to shore for my life. I may be in a storm, but the storm surge can be swam. You ever been to the beach? You learn something really quick about the beach. And me and my brother-in-law were talking about this the other day. We went to Maui. I've had the chance, blessed to be able to go to Maui. I went with my brother-in-law, sister-in-law, in-laws. We all came. Me and my brother-in-law were in the ocean. We were snorkeling. It was a good time. I grew up in Louisiana. I grew up a few hours from the beach. We would go to the beach a lot. I would go to the beach 3 or 4 times each summer. And so I'm super comfortable in the ocean. And we went to the ocean where it's not super clean. And so if you dive down, you're going to see a giant fish swim by you real quick. And that's unnerving to people who are not used to that. And yet, I'm very comfortable in the water. I'm very comfortable at the beach, very comfortable in the ocean. I'm very comfortable when a fish kind of nibbles at your leg. That is just a part of being in the ocean. My brother-in-law had never been to the ocean, and we were off of a reef cliff where you could hear whales. You couldn't see them, but you could hear them out in the distance underneath the water squealing because it was then migration time. And I am filming underneath the water, and a huge wave just hits me. I'm thrashing. I have it on video too. I'll show you one day. I am thrashed and everything. Like, whoa, that was crazy. And I was like, man, that's wild. And well, the thrashing brought up a sea turtle from where I couldn't see him. I was like, oh, the sea turtle. I swam over to the sea turtle. I was like, man, my brother-in-law needs to see this sea turtle. I could have touched him, okay? He bumped into me. I didn't touch him, okay? That's illegal. But he was right there. And I look up and I say, Tyler, where's my brother-in-law? He is climbing a rock face. His flipper floats by me into open ocean. His snorkel is somewhere over there. I'm like, what the world happened to you? He wasn't ready for that storm. He wasn't ready for the surge. If you see a surge come in, it's very simple. You go underneath it. You just go underneath the surge. It's perfectly fine. And you'll come up and you'll be generally in the same place. I had to go swim out to open ocean to get his flipper. I swam out to other different parts of the open ocean. I mean, you couldn't see the bottom at that point. I grabbed a snorkel. I'm swimming back. And he says, dude, I almost died. It took me out. I don't know where my flipper is. I don't know what's going on. We got to get back to the beach. I said, well, I have all the other accessories, so let's get you back. And he's like, I didn't know it could be like that. And I was like, well, you've never been in the ocean? He's like, no. I was like, bro, you have got to tell me stuff like that. We were talking about that yesterday and how he's like, that is the first time I thought I could die. I really could die. And yet, Paul is in an actual storm surge, a real situation where he could die. And he says, you know what? I guess this is just where life takes me at the moment. This is where the presence of God has somehow ordered my steps. Somehow, this is going to work out for the good. It's not all good at the moment, but it's going to work out for the good. And so he gets to Malta. We were brought safely through. And then we learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us an unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire, welcomed us because it had began to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. And when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he is a god. He was a god. Now, that's pretty good extremes. Like, you're either going to die or you're a god. There is no middle ground. And yet, people have consequences to their actions. We know that one thing I wanted to make sure is this really shows you something that people without Christ can think, is that the gods are after you to kind of punish you in certain ways. And I want to tell you, God doesn't do stuff like that, okay? There are times where the consequences of your actions are very real, okay? You spend the last 20 years doing drugs, your mind is not going to think super clearly. It's just not. It's just a byproduct of drugs. If you murder someone, you may have to go to prison. However, I remember a funeral that I did since I have been here in Gothenburg. I did a funeral, and the mother came up to me and said, you know what? I know that God did this because I haven't been going to church. And I said, stop that right now. I said, God does not punish you like that, and he does not pick on you. You see, these people were thinking that exact same way. You know what? The viper bit his hand because he's a murderer. He was supposed to die in the surf. Somehow he survived. But now the God sent something to hurt him. Look, God does not do stuff like that. Job is a different exception. Some of you have Job in the back of your mind. Job is an exception to the rule because of an application we'll talk about later. However, God does not pick on you for the sake of picking on you. If you say, I have this because of that, that statement is not true no matter what the situation. Now, like I said, there are certain situations where sin can affect you. Sin will bring forth death when it is fully grown. You murder someone, you may have to go to prison. You take drugs, your mind may not work as sharp as it should. You don't take care of your body, there may be complications later on down the road. However, God does not say, I'm going to do this because of this. You see, God is actually very patient in His judgment. And He waits and He waits and He waits and He waits until we are before Him, and then He judges us. But that's why today is the day of salvation. You do not wait. You do not stop. You do not say next week. You do not say, well, I'll be back Wednesday. No, today is the day of salvation. You don't know when your judgment is going to be here. Now, God does judge nations. That's actually kind of a different conversation. God does judge nations. That's very different. He judges us accumulatively. However, at the same time, God judging nations does not supersede that the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church, because, like Don said earlier, actually in Sunday school, how the gates of hell shall not prevail against America is not what that verse says. Now, I pray that it doesn't. You can pray that that does it. That's perfectly fine. But it says the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. We see that playing out right now in China, and in North Korea, in Afghanistan, in Iran. We see the church growing in the midst of persecution, trials, tribulations, temptations, and yet the church shall prevail. But we also have to understand there can be tumultuous times in the midst of that. There may be a storm surge in your life. There may be a shipwreck in your life. There may be something that seems completely out of your control. And guess what? It is. It is, absolutely. Say, well, God will never give me more than I can handle. Well, that's not in the Bible anywhere. God will never give you more than He can handle. But yes, God gives you more than you can handle all the time. Paul even states that himself. He says, I was being pushed, I was being persecuted beyond my ability. He says that just blatantly in some of his prison letters. And yet, yes, you can be in times where you're in situations that it's over your head. However, in those moments, we give those pressures, anxieties, those things to God. Because Christ says, look, you put on His burden and it's light. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. Do you know why that is? Because we take our burdens and we give it to Him. That is the burden of Christ, is to take off of your own burdens. That's why His burden is light, because His burden is to take our burdens. His yoke is to take that which strangles us and holds us. It's to give it to Him. And through that process, it's light. We have this weight that is lifted off of our shoulders. Now, Paul in this situation sees a snake and flings it into the fire. It's not very spiritual. I think that some of you would also do the same thing. Any one of you do the same thing? If a viper bit you, some of you wouldn't be awake because you'd have passed out. It's just the sheer fact that there's a snake that is bitten onto you. A viper, something poisonous, he shakes it into the fire. They see him. Oh, he's a murderer. He just escaped the sea. He doesn't swell up. He doesn't die. He says, oh, he must be a god. And then Paul corrects him very quickly. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to chieftain and the islands. And named Publius, but who received us and entertained us hospitality for 3 days. It happened the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when he had this taken place, the rest of the people of the island who had diseases also came and were cursed. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed, which is very rare in a situation where you live on an island. You do not have extras, and yet these people were being very, very nice to him. Now, what's interesting, I think something to consider earlier in Acts, other times when they are in different places, they actually try to start worshiping Paul again. They do this several times. People like to see those miraculous moments, and Paul said, "Hey, no, I'm not the God. I'm not God, but I do know Him. I see all these gods around you, but the unknown God, I know that one, the real true God." You see, Paul never takes a moment to break and say, "Well, I'm just tired." He can sleep at night. He can sleep later. He immediately starts ministering to them. And we know to this day that some of the people that came to the Lord through this visitation, it's a short story, but some of the people that came, that's why there's houses and churches and people and a thriving community on the island of Malta to today, is because of what Paul did back then. But he never really got to see the fruit of it. Because some of the moments where he was doing that, guess what? They were still on their way to Rome. They were still on their way to prison. And yet, while he's in these moments of life that are very hard, he still ministers. He still sees what God can do in the moment. And he sees the fruit that is available. He was a living sacrifice. Paul teaches us that. He lived as though there was a real living sacrifice. We're told to do that in Romans 12. It says, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." So think about some of the things Paul was. How are you acting when you're standing before a king? He saw the fruit ready for the harvest. He was shipwrecked and he saw the fruit ready for the harvest. When no one is watching, what do? Are you considering your life with Christ? Are you kind of just letting that be there? Are you separating your church life from your family life or your house life, your home? As Christians, we are to be living sacrifices and say, "Lord, what is it that you want me to do? How do you want me to How do you want me to work my finances? How do you want me to speak to this person today? What storm in my life can I give over to you? What problem maybe I'm having, can I just say, Lord, it's just in your hands. I don't know what else to do with that, Lord." Whatever family member is in your life that you're struggling for, look, it's certainly okay to pray for those who are far from the Lord and to want them. But there's a point where worry and stress can overwhelm us, and we don't need to get to that point. And yet, the Lord is with us. He's guiding us. He's directing us. I want you to understand, lean on the Lord this week. And I want you to practice it too. I mean, when you're in a situation that's hard, say, "Lord, I'm leaning on you." When you're in a heated conversation, "Lord, I am leaning on you." When you're talking with someone that you don't get along with, or maybe it's a hard situation to be in, you're looking at your finances, you're looking at your marriage, whatever it could be, you say, "Lord, I am leaning on you. I'm trusting in you." And I'll tell you something, sometimes you need to verbalize that. You need to hear it for yourself. I do that during the week myself. I say, "Lord," I say it so I can hear it. "Lord, I am leaning on you. I am trusting in you. I am hoping in you. I'm relying on you. I don't know which way to go. It'd be great if you told me, But until then, I'm trusting in you. If you need prayer today, if you need for us to come together to pray with you about something in your life, it could be healing, it could be situational, it could be boldness, it could be a ton of things. But if there's something in your life you need prayer for today, we want to open up these altars while we're worshiping and say, Lord, I want to lean on you. I want to trust in you. I want to rely on you. I want to have hope in you. I want to have peace in you. If you need prayer today, I want you to come down front and we will pray for you. But as we worship the Lord, just think of His goodness. Think of those storms in your life that the Lord has already led you through, already guided you through. And let's pray for one another today. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord.